Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Transmedia Arts Seminar, co-hosted by Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard and MetaLab at Harvard. We are very thankful for MetaLab for hosting us and for allowing this space. Today, my name is Magda Romanska, and I am the chair of the Transmedia Arts Seminar. And today, I'm very pleased and very happy to host Lance WEILER, who is a director of the Columbia Storytelling Lab and also a storyteller and an entrepreneur and thought leader. He is recognized as a pioneer in mixing storytelling and technology. Wired magazine named him one of 25 people helping to reinvent entertainment when he disrupted the industry with the release of his first feature, The Last Broadcast. He co-wrote, co-directed, and co-produced, and ultimately self-distributed The Last Broadcast, which was made for $900 and went on to gross over $5 million as the first all-digital release of a motion picture to theaters via satellite. And the distribution method that Lance introduced have since become a standard for digital cinema distribution today. After the success of The Last Broadcast, he began to work extensively as a writer, director, and producer, developing TV and film properties for Fox, TNT, Starz, and Endemol. In addition to his own projects, Lance often collaborates with other storytellers. In 2010, he was nominated for the International Emmy in Digital Fiction for his work on Collapses, the Energy Risk Conspiracy. And in 2014, he was a creative director and experience designer for Body Mind Change, and immersive storytelling project in collaboration with David Cronenberg, TIFF, and the CFC. And this project was recognized for its innovative use of story and code, winning Muse Jim Blackbaby Ingenuity Award and receiving a Webby honorable mention in the games and augmented reality category. His use of emergent technology have made him highly sought after thought leader in the entertainment industry, in particular supporting companies in reshaping their holdings for the 21st century. He has consulted on numerous initiatives for IBM, Twitter, Microsoft, Samsung, Channing Entertainment, Ubisoft, Penguin Books, and the US State Department. He has helped create, design, shape entertainment properties that have reached billions of people. After speaking at the World Economic Forum in 2012, Lance was invited to serve on 2 steering committees, one focused on the future of content creation and the other centered on digital governance. Since 2013, he has been a founding member and director of the Columbia University School of the Arts Digital Storytelling Lab, leading the lab's activities and helping to shape its enduring vision. We are extremely pleased and very happy to welcome Lance to our seminar, and we very much look forward to his lecture on decentralized storytelling, where AI, the blockchain, code, and the metaverse intersect. Thank you so much, Lance. We very much appreciate and are grateful and excited for this lecture. I'm going to go off screen right now, leaving Lance the screen.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm excited to join you for today. As mentioned, my name is Lance WEILER, and today I'm going to be talking about an approach towards the metaverse that maybe will be quite different than some of the things that maybe have been buzzing around in the news today in regards to Facebook now becoming Meta. We'll table that for a moment. But I want to kind of come at this from a different perspective. I want to come at it from a very participatory perspective. I want to come at it from a collaborative kind of storytelling perspective. So I have some slides that I'm going to share. I'm just going to share my screen. Give me 1 second here to bring this up. Okay, so today we'll be kind of looking at decentralized storytelling where AI, the blockchain code, and the metaverse intersect. And the one thing that I want to say is a lot of the work that I do usually starts with a human element first and is very interested in, kind of wrapping my head around the possibilities. Really, at the core, I'm a storyteller. And so today's talk is really going to look at it from the perspective of telling stories with large groups of people. So I want to start, because I'm a storyteller, with an origin story. We heard a little bit about a movie that I had made that was called The Last Broadcast, but what you're looking at here is a device from the last century, which is the Bolex spring-wound camera. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this device, but for those who are not, it's a motion picture camera that was spring-wound. And it was the first camera I ever had. I bought it when I was in high school with money that I had saved from a part-time job. And I just started making films, and I was fascinated by cinema. I fell in love with cinema, and just, it encompassed, it just consumed me in terms of what I was interested in doing. And over the last 20 years, I've worked primarily in film and television, theater, games, and installations, and often find it very difficult to classify what I do. It's not kind of dictated by any one format. But I want to go back to a moment where it was mentioned in the intro to the last broadcast, because I think that this is very much an epiphany moment for me in my own trajectory as a storyteller. I was at Penn Station after working all night on a music video, because I had started out as a journeyman. I worked in commercial production, worked my way all the way up through the ranks, and eventually became a camera operator, a DP, a director, and a producer. But after working all night on a music video, I found myself in a situation where I was flipping through a magazine in Penn Station, and I came across an ad for a piece of hardware that you could put into a desktop computer that would allow you to edit. This is in 1996. So now it seems novel because you can edit on a mobile phone, but at that time, it was it was something that was really kind of quite groundbreaking. And so I went to work with a colleague, Stefan Avalos, and we started trying to make a movie for no money, because we were trying to move away from some of the permission-based culture that existed in and around film at that time. I had failed miserably trying to raise money for a science fiction film that I wanted to make, and I was trying to raise 250,000. I raised 30,000 and ended up returning the money, whereas Stefan had been ripped off by a foreign sales agent. And so we found ourselves in this situation where we were like, we wonder if we could make a movie for no money. Now, as you heard, the movie itself was made for $900. That's when we totaled up all the receipts. The reason I wanted to start with sharing this is this movie represents something that I think is very interesting in terms of its trajectory, the way in which it was kind of railing against permission-based culture, the way in which it was democratized, or it was the early signs of the democratization of certain technology that would allow you to be able to make a motion picture from start to finish, but also this notion of creating a world or building a world. With The Last Broadcast, the storyline centers on a public access paranormal variety show where the two hosts for the show get a viewer's suggestion to do a story about the Jersey Devil, which is a winged demon creature that lives in central southern New Jersey. And they assemble a team, a paranormal sound recordist and a supposed psychic, and they go deep into the woods in search of this Jersey Devil. 4 of them go in, and only 1 comes out alive, and he's blamed for the murders of the other 3. And that's where we enter the story through the eyes of the documentary filmmaker. Now, when we were releasing this, we were experimenting. We were very influenced by, didn't know what they were called at the time, but we were doing quite a bit where we were kind of building our own augmented, kind of reality games without knowing what they were actually called. And we, we had come up, we had a site for the movie back in 1996, And we had experimented with creating a variety of subsites and kind of building this whole story world around everything that we were doing that kind of centered around this idea of fact or fiction, right? That was the name of the paranormal variety show. Now, this world kind of consisted of a number of different elements. You know, it had the website, it had the film itself. And when it came time to distribute the film, we found ourselves at a crossroads where we had made this on our desktop computers. To give you an idea of how painstaking it was, it took 86 days, that's 86 days to render the movie, 86 days. And so, you know, we wanted to distribute it in a way that would allow us to be able to show it, you know, without it being on kind of a lower end projector. And we didn't want to pay $30,000 to transfer it to film. But at that time, really the only way, and this is still kind of true, the only way that you could, with an independent work, that you could find distribution was through festivals. They were kind of gatekeepers for that distribution. So anyway, we ended up self-distributing the movie, and we ended up innovating, you know, delivery via satellite, as was mentioned at the top in the bio that was read. But the thing that was interesting about it is, I think in a lot of ways, the reason that the project was successful is because we were naive. We did not know what we couldn't do. And because we didn't know, and because it cost so little, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a line item in the largest film at that particular year when this came out in 1998. If you looked at the Titanic, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a $900 line item in that budget. So it was as though we could have buried the movie. It didn't, you know, we could have buried it in the backyard. And because of that, we were freed in the process. Now, I think for the longest time, you know, my parents have always kind of wondered what I did. I think that it started to make a little more sense for them when, you know, when the movie became a question on Jeopardy. It was a double Jeopardy question, and the contestant answered it correctly, which was wonderful. But basically, it kind of was this zeitgeist moment where we were innovating what was possible with cinema at a time where this hadn't been done before. It's interesting to note that the movie would go on and be distributed via satellite. We created our own kind of company around it, and we self-distributed and turned down different studio offers for the movie over time. But I felt kind of confined. You know, I felt confined by formats and running times and platforms. Here I was experimenting with this idea of building a world, and that world was spilling off a screen and into the real world and back. And so when it came time to make another work, the next film that I made in 2006, it was a movie called Head Trauma. And I wanted to kind of take some of my experience with gaming and start to fuse it into this, this initial, you know, experimenting with what was possible with the film itself. And you know, I ended up doing a theatrical release with it. We sold it to Showtime, released it on DVD, and we staged a number of cinematic events with it. And I want to talk about that specifically because I think some of these early experiments hint towards this notion of kind of a seamless, or an attempt to create a seamless storytelling experience that can follow someone in some way, right? And the promise of the metaverse is this notion of being able to bridge virtual worlds, and also the potential of being able to have those be influencing or feeding off of what's happening in the real world too, you know, through a variety of the potential of augmenting the real world in interesting ways. And I'll get more into that in the later part of this lecture. What you see in front of you here is a diagram. This is an early diagram. And it was interesting because when I was doing this work back in 2006, I was not aware of the term transmedia. I would soon become aware of it probably around 2006, 2007, when Henry Jenkins, who had done quite a bit of writing around it, had invited me up to MIT to be a part of a lecture there, because the work that I was doing was intersecting with some of what he was writing about. So this diagram here shows the ecosystem of this project. You know, at its core, there was a feature film. There was an interactive comic that was browser-based. There was web series that you could interface with that was online. There were these interesting player remixes where you could remix things through a browser. And when you would remix them, it would unlock various elements of the story. There was use of mobile, primarily in conjunction with theatrical showings. And then there was a series of live events. I want to talk specifically about the interactive comic, the mobile, and the live events for this example here. So I want you to pretend that it's 2006 and there are still, you know, payphones, right? I know that they're an endangered species and you don't really see them anymore, but at that time they were prevalent still. And I want you to imagine that you're walking to a cinema and you're walking down the street and all of a sudden all the phones start ringing up and down the block. We wrote software that allowed us to ring all the phones simultaneously. So somebody picks up the phone and they hear some foreshadowing elements of the story, but they're not really sure and they kind of hang it up. Then they walk around the corner and they encounter this preacher who's preaching fire and brimstone, and he hands them a comic, like kind of almost like a Jack Chick, you know, religious propaganda comic. It's like kind of in that weird world. And they take it and they're not really sure what it's for. Maybe they put it in their pocket, maybe they discard it, I'm not sure, you know. And they make their way into the cinema. We took this into alternate venues. We took it to museums, we took it to universities, we took it to theaters. And when they would come into the actual theater, there would be on screen, it would say, whatever you do, do not call this number, danger, danger. And of course, like 80% or more of them did. And once they did, we captured their phone number. And then what kind of ensued during the movie was the lights go down and all of a sudden all these characters start to emerge from the audience and they're kind of like very William Castle-esque, you know, and then everybody's phones start ringing. And then we start connecting people to each other's phones, and it was really chaotic. And it was a huge mess, and it was almost like kind of like Lawnmower Man or something. And all these phones are ringing in the theater, and it was really quite, it was baffling to most of the audience. But after they left and they went home, if they looked and they looked at that comic, it said, "Do you want to play a game?" And it gave them a URL to the interactive comic, which was a browser-based experience. And so now they're on their computer and they're going through the comic, and all of a sudden their phone rings. And they answer the phone, and on the phone is the nemesis from the movie. It's all been designed and it's automated. So the nemesis starts talking to them, and based upon their responses through the phone, it starts to launch video and audio at them, right, through the browser. And then at a certain point, the nemesis from the story says, "Tell me something about yourself that nobody knows," at which point the people say something through their phone and it starts echoing back through their computer speakers. And of course, this freaks them out and they go to close out the site. But when they click the exit box, it's not a real exit box. They click it. We know that they've clicked it, and we drop them into a conversation with everybody else who's on the site at that moment, and they go into a conference call. So what I described to you starts as an individual moment into a communal moment in a cinema, to an individual moment on a browser, into a community-based moment or communal moment with a group of people through a conference call. That's like really very early rudimentary ways to kind of move people through different elements of a world. And I think that there's a quality to that. And this is a law, one of the 3 laws by Arthur C. Clarke, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So what I just described to you, a lot of the people who engaged in it felt like it was magic. You know, they didn't know how it was working. They weren't really sure what it was doing. And they were, in this case, because it was a horror-related psychological thriller, they were scared or creeped out by the results. Now, with this idea that Clarke is describing, one of the things I became really fascinated with is this notion of making things enchanted. And I had 4 things that really radically shifted my practice. You know, one was design thinking, which I'll get into in a moment. The next was speculative design, which is around futures and speculating and kind of creating scenarios that allow you to imagine potential futures. The next is MDA theory, which is a theory that's used for the evaluation and the design of games. And the last was this notion of experience design, because a lot of my stories were moving away from just being with one format. And they were moving into this realm of where they were these worlds that I was creating, and that they would have multiple kind of moments and potential entry points. So design thinking, for anybody who's not familiar with it, kind of goes across 5 phases. The empathy phase is really kind of almost like a shared ethnography, where you're kind of drilling down and you're trying to figure out a need. Then you're defining that need with usually a design question. How might we? Once you have that question, then you start to answer it through kind of ideation, and that ideation gives life to a prototype. Once you have that prototype, you then start to test it, and this process repeats itself. The reason I bring up design thinking is a lot of the storytelling that I started to do started to mix with code in really dynamic ways, and it started to challenge the notion of what a story was in terms of not only how people were entering it, but the story maybe didn't necessarily, it had a beginning, middle, and end, but maybe, to quote Godard, maybe not necessarily in that particular order, right? And so I found design practice really started to help open me up and allowed me to start thinking differently about the way that I was building these worlds. This is by Elliot P. Montgomery, who's a futurist. It's a mapping of design practice from the unconstrained to the constrained. A lot of the work that I do kind of lives across this whole diagram, actually. There's elements of design thinking and design futures, speculative design and art futures into science fiction, design fiction, and into art. And I found that design practice was a really interesting way for me to challenge how I was actually creating this work, right? Like how could I make the work more responsive? How could I make the work more engaging? And how could I make the work more pervasive? This is the Experiential Futures Ladder by Dr. Stuart Candy, who's a futurist who's at Carnegie Mellon University. And this, a lot of times when you think about futures, they're very abstracted, right? And the notion of this is kind of, and for anybody who's a writer, you'll recognize setting, scenario, situation. Stuff is kind of almost like props. It's like artifacts. And the idea is that you move from something that's abstracted, a view of the future, and by using a setting and then creating a scenario and then deriving a situation, you then create these artifacts. And those artifacts allow you to start to make the future more concrete. This, I think, is important because as we start to think about the metaverse and we start to think about decentralized technologies and the possibilities of them, it places us into a terrain where linear kind of process doesn't necessarily adhere, or the ability where, when I came up as a storyteller, it was very auteur driven in terms of the way that works were made. We're now in a place where it's much more horizontal. And I think there's a potential for a lot of this work to be able to be more impactful. So at the Digital Storytelling Lab, for instance, we explore new forms and functions of storytelling. Forms being emergent technologies like AI, the Internet of Things, augmented reality, virtual reality, and so forth. And then the functions are story for healing and learning and mobilization, policy change, and entertainment. And often what's beautiful about embracing futures is it's kind of almost like yes and thinking. Design thinking uses that too. Futures presents that because you're imagining worlds where today's rules don't necessarily apply. So MDA is interesting because it's a theory, it's a framework that allows someone who's a player to come from one side and who's a designer to come from the other. So M stands for mechanics, D stands for dynamics, which is like kind of behaviors, and A stands for aesthetics. So if I'm a player, I come in and I feel something. In feeling it, I start to learn these behaviors, and then lo and behold, I learn the mechanics. If I'm designing something, I start with the mechanics, and then what I hope those mechanics will deliver is in terms of a behavior, and then ultimately, hopefully, what will be an aesthetic, a feeling for the player. There's a white paper, if you're interested, you can read all about it. It's MDA, a formal approach to game design. But what we end up doing and extracting from this is this notion of an aesthetic. How can you lay an aesthetic over a story and also over a world. So the last thing that changed my practice is this notion of experience design. A lot of digital experiences don't necessarily really think about the way that you're coming into them. They're not thinking about how you're primed for them. They're not necessarily thinking about what happens when you leave them. And experience design challenges you to kind of think about the whole journey that somebody has in it. But if we're in a moment, this is from Joseph Campbell, where he tracked over 1,000 different stories and found that they had these common characteristics. If you look at this diagram, pretty much every Pixar film maps to it. Star Wars maps to it. In fact, Joseph Campbell was an advisor to Star Wars when they were making the first one. But now we're in a point where it's not just a single hero's journey, it's the potential of what's a collective journey look like, and how does that operate, and what are the possibilities, right? And if you start to think about the way that worlds are mapped or made, this is a really interesting diagram. I really enjoy this because it shows the complexity of Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, but then down to the right, spoiler alert for anybody that hasn't seen Primer, that's a story where the protagonists keep intersecting. It's a time travel story, and they keep intersecting with future versions of themselves. And then 12 Angry Men, which is a very linear progression across that story. But it's interesting to start to think about, well, what is it like to actually map these stories? What could a story be? How could we actually interact with it? And when you start to think about the potential of worlds, creating worlds, and the way in which you move through them, you start to realize that we're in this really interesting shift where it moves from kind of a one to many. Even though I'm talking to all of you right now, we're moving into a many to many paradigm, and have been for quite some time. We saw with that primarily coming with Web 2.0 and social media and so forth and so on. But this notion of those formerly known as the audience is really interesting, because I feel that one of the biggest aspects of the metaverse is going to come from understanding participatory culture. And I want to give you an example. During the height of the pandemic, when it was first in 2020, my son invited me to come check out Travis Scott within Fortnite. Fortnite is a sandbox game where it's battle royale mode, 100 players, and you can build various things and you compete against each other for resources. And then ultimately it's the last person standing wins. Fortnite brought in Travis Scott, and the world kind of hosted this show, and subsequently a number of other events have taken place within Fortnite. But what was fascinating about this was my son, who's 13, he started out, he's come and lectured my class at Columbia, my graduate students, and he's lectured because he started out with like Roblox and Minecraft, and he would make these Let's Play videos. And he's come and lectured my class about the currency within those games and how the worlds work. And he's very well versed in that, and eventually kind of moved into, Fortnite and TikTok and so forth and so on. And he creates stories on a regular basis. So with this, the reason I bring it up is I'm there, I'm watching this, and my son is there making thumbnails for his friend, who's a YouTube streamer, who's doing a fashion show at the exact same time that Travis Scott is playing. All these other people are in world playing the game while Travis Scott is playing. And you have these ecosystems. And it made me think of, this is going to sound odd, but it made me think of the Grateful Dead. It made me think about the rise of tape culture, the taping of those live shows, and the ecosystems that existed, the creative ecosystems that existed in and around the Grateful Dead. And the Dead allowed people to tape, not because it was foresight on their part, but because they didn't want to crack down on it. They were anti-authoritarian. They didn't want to set any rules. So they allowed people to be able to record. And that gave rise to a whole tape culture, gave rise to a whole set of economies in and around the world of their music, which was really kind of fascinating. And so I was struck by this notion of, what if the story is the same and the telling, that's the part that's changing. So as my son and his friends are building a storytelling experience and a social experience set against a larger experience that's being run through a game that has concurrent users like Fortnite, 28 million of them. What does that mean in terms of as we move forward with, this notion of what the metaverse could be? What is the role of participants within that? And if you look at certain advancements in terms of, the rise, like I think back a couple of years to No Man's Sky. When that game came out, it had generative worlds. And initially there were complaints because people couldn't find anybody else in the game. I mean, I think it was very, very probably designed to be like what actual traveling through multiple galaxies is like. The likelihood of running into somebody is pretty slim to none. So, but anyway, they ended up changing some of that in future subsequent releases. But this notion of generative worlds, right? So you have gaming engines are getting better. You have the rise of AI and the ability to create synthetic characters and to build out these generative worlds. And the part that I think is really, really critical is this element of collaboration within these spaces and this notion of how audiences shift and start to become storytellers in their own right. And some people talk about that in terms of customization, some people talk about that in terms of collectibles, some people talk about that in terms of, just overall consumption. I'm very much interested in it in terms of how it can be harnessed as something for social impact. So speaking and kind of building on that social kind of impact theme, this is an example of a project, because I'm going to shift now into a couple examples to give you a sense of how we're building worlds now after, kind of learning some of those elements and adapting some of those methods, design thinking, speculative design, MDA theory, and experience design. This project is called Project Immerse, and the way that it works is it started out as just a collaborative deepfake paranoid thriller. In this instance, what I'm going to show played out across web pervasive technologies. I'm very interested in inclusive design practice and really interested in how we can prototype elements of the metaverse without necessarily having to be reliant solely on hardware, or hardware that isn't accessible to as many people. And so this project made use of these web pervasive tools, arguably kind of subverting productivity tools and turning them into collaborative storytelling and sense-making tools. And in this particular narrative, the narrative conceit of this is there's a data dump. You're not exactly sure who's giving it to you or what it's about. But you have to work with other people to figure it out. So you have editorial ability within Miro, which is a collaborative whiteboarding platform, and you have the ability to kind of move layers around and play rich media, video, audio, uncover text, and you're working with a group of people in breakout rooms. Now, what starts to happen is when you're in the breakout rooms, bots start to intersect with those breakout rooms and they start to impersonate the humans. And they start to push misinformation, because this piece is really exploring this idea of misinformation in an age of misinformation and deception in an age of in an age of AI and deep fakes, shallow fakes, so forth and so on. And so you're experiencing that, and this is all rooted also in apathenia, this idea that we look for patterns within things and we find meaning with them and in them, and we shape stories through that. So as the group is kind of maneuvering and moving through this, it's kind of almost like an escape room meets an immersive theater piece set against kind of this learning simulation, I guess you could say. And so as they make their way through it, they start to create theories. Every time this is run, it's totally different, because 90% of what they are encountering in this experience is made by AI. Right? So all the video, all the audio, all the, the voices, all the images, all made with AI, like 90% of it. So, the deep fakes kind of interact with them. This is a visual representation of one of the deep fakes that's stylized. The deep fake kind of, at certain points, this is the nemesis in the story. You'll be pulled out of a breakout room and you'll end up in a breakout room just with the AI. And the AI will start giving you information and will start showing you things, and then we'll kind of dump you back into the experience. These are other examples of, some of the quality of the deep fakes that exist within it. And then also a lot of this piece was kind of mapped off of, we did a lot of research around QAnon. This piece was supported by the Brown Institute for Media Innovation and received a seed grant from them. But we studied QAnon for quite some time, and then the project became even more prescient with the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. But Project Immerse is fascinating too, because everything that the AI creates is trained off of the following: declassified, redacted documents, data dumps from Blue Leaks and WikiLeaks, political speeches, court documents, fake news stories, and 70s paranoid thrillers. So you find yourself in this world where the only thing you can trust are the other people that you're in the experience with. So in some ways, it's very much like a discursive design artifact. It's intended to allow you to step into a world, immerse yourself in that world, and then on the other side of it, we have these interesting debriefs and conversations about the underlying technology. Everything that we used to build this was all accessible, did not require any code. So we do that purposely to show how pervasive this type of technology is. So AI is accelerating, and the ability to augment creative process is accelerating, which is a component of what is going to be necessary in order to fulfill a metaverse, right? This idea of the ability to personalize experiences, the ability to create worlds that are more aware of surroundings and others. And you see the rise of this, particularly in the virtual beings movement, and in, you've seen it early on with like virtual influencers and so forth and so on. The next project I want to mention is called Frankenstein AI. Frankenstein AI really kind of takes some of the tenets of the book and kind of uses AI as a metaphor, kind of for something that, like the book, what happens when we create something and it gets outside of our control. And so the project is really about how human are you, right? And the narrative conceit of this project is that Frankenstein, a monster, has been wandering the internet in search of what it means to be human, and has encountered a lot of polarization and toxicity and extreme hate and extreme love, and is confused by what it's found and decides to assemble humans in the real world so that it can learn what it means to be human. And we took this to the Sundance Film Festival as a 3-act performance. What you see here in this image is two people would sit down with each other, and one would share a story of isolation, the other would share a story of connection, and then the table that they were seated around would come to life. It was a surface unit, and all of a sudden would come to life, and then there was a planchette, kind of like a Ouija board controller, and if they both put their hands on it, they could start to move it, and they could interact with the table in really dynamic ways. And they started to map their conversation. So they were giving data to the AI. So that happened in the first part of the experience. Now, after they've had that conversation, they've mapped their conversation, they would make their way into a space, into a room, which is that tank there was quite large. It was the AI, and the AI would be amorphous and then would take on human form, and it was projected through smoke, and then the drums were its voice, so they were IoT enabled. And so the soundtrack and the images and everything was coming live from the internet based upon the interaction with the participants. So we trained the AI to work from a question corpus. And we did that by creating what we called Fakenstein, which was a chatbot that we trained to write in Shelley prose. And then we also brought in data from the internet, data from Reddit and a whole bunch of other places, and we created a question corpus. The first question that the AI ever asked, because like what would happen is you'd have a group of participants who had gone through that first part, they come into this room, the AI would greet them by name, and then would start asking them questions. And then the questions that they asked, the group would start to became very philosophical. They would start to discuss what those things meant, and then they would commit something back to the machine collectively that they felt would help it to learn what it meant to be human. So two of the first questions that it ever asked were, why do humans like having sex even though they can see in color? And then the second was, why do humans are there times where humans, I'm forgetting the second one. What is it like? Are there times where humans can't wear human? And that second one was really interesting, for instance, because people would start to debate, are there times when we're not human? And then they would start to ask that with each other, and, you know, when are we not human? Why are we not human? And then they would give something to the AI. And then ultimately what that led to was a dance piece where a dancer was, we did machine learning choreography, and the AI controlled the dancer through an earpiece based upon audience interactions. And so the dance piece came to life based upon what the audience was doing, based upon a data that was collected throughout the experience. This project then became a dinner party. We were commissioned by the National Theater and also IFA Doc Lab, and it became a series of dinner parties all over the world where an AI would host them, and the AI would ask questions to people through their ear, through an earpiece. And it would say something to one person and say, hey, restate this in your own words, or it might ask a question to half the group, or it might tell somebody to lean over and whisper something to another person at the table. And it was this really interesting social dynamic of conversation. So this piece kind of explored this notion of what is it like to tell stories potentially with AI. Now, this last example that I want to give here is a very, very personal piece, but I think it's interesting because it started as a physical installation, is this ability to bridge virtual and physical environments. Those physical environments could be augmented in a variety of ways. It might make use of augmented reality in the future. But this particular project made use of, it started as an installation in a 1,400 square foot space. It's a project that I did with my father. He was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. And as he was dying, he invited me to come and ask him anything that I wanted before he died. And I grew up in a firefighting household. My dad was an amateur fire scene photographer, and he shot thousands and thousands of photos of various things in states of burning. And in my youth, there were 2 devastating fires. One where our van erupted in flames while we were in it on a vacation, and another where 11 months later, our house burnt down. And so for a long period of time, I wondered if my dad actually set those fires. So this piece is really kind of about an immersive storytelling experience that kind of looks at life, loss, and memory, and how memory is malleable. The inciting incident for it came from a lack of empathy in my dad's care when he was diagnosed, and we came to realize how much time he was going to have. We were so shaken, I was so shaken by that, I thought there must be a way that you could build an experience, a world, a story that would allow people to have difficult conversations around topics that were challenging or polarizing. And so it started as building a space that people would move through together. They would move through this 1,400 square foot installation. It was all dark. And this is some of the aesthetic of what they would see. But this experience started with them doing a visualization exercise that asked them to save something that they were emotionally connected to from a house or somewhere that they lived before they died. I'm sorry, before the house burned down or the building burned down. And they were what they chose to save and why they chose to save it. And then at the end of the experience, they end up letting it go. Because this piece's aesthetic is all about how grief is nonlinear and how you find yourself navigating. You're kind of alone yet together in grief a lot of the time. And this piece kind of looks at grief as a generative work. The reason I bring this up is when the pandemic hit, we started experimenting with this notion of kind of creating a world that would allow us to look at it in a virtual way. Once the pandemic came, we couldn't necessarily do the same installations that we were commissioned to do. So I started to imagine it in a virtual context, and within that virtual context, started to play with this. Seeing here is where 100 people kind of move through these fragments of memory, and they move through them, and they're able to work with people once again in breakout rooms. They're able to kind of navigate concurrently And what I love about this is it's an infinite canvas, similar to what I was talking about with, something like the move and start to uncover certain things, entries, and there were rich media assets, video and audio. And then there were moments where they were prompted and asked to kind of reflect on certain things, like what might they do before they died? What did they want to do before they died? Or I would lead people to certain interactions, like here it's showing that I lead like one person to this special part of the board and then cover it over and then bring somebody else there. So this idea that there's things that are hidden underneath the surface that maybe you don't have a chance to see. And this notion of a concurrent space where people are uncovering things and talking to each other as they're doing it, but then it's leaving room for them to participate. This is a moment in the experience where two people find each other and they have a conversation where they read a script. One's a funeral director and the other is a grieving family member. This is an example of an aesthetic related to worry. Like I'm up at 3:26 in the morning staring at the ceiling, and when you move that, you see all the other things that are connected to it. This is just a closing beat where you're asked to let go of that item that you chose to save at the beginning of the experience. So what's been interesting about this is we've been prototyping this, and the reason I wanted to share some of this with the use of things like Miro is it has a free educational license, and we use it like in theater, and we use it in a lot of ways to prototype things. And I think it's an interesting way to be able to build a world relatively quickly. In Where There's Smoke, the part that's really powerful is there's a story that's about my father and I, but that's the springboard that allows people to tell their own stories or have their own reflections. So I'm hopeful that the metaverse can be something that is beyond walled gardens. The announcement today about Meta and the drive of certain large organizations to kind of own what Web 3.0 is kind of disturbing to me personally. I'm excited that maybe Web 3.0, could become, or at least have some of the promise of the original internet, the openness of the original internet. And I think some of the exciting things that are happening in and around that can be found within decentralized technologies such as the blockchain, which I think has the potential to be a fundamental layer of the metaverse. Not only in terms of, a lot of people have probably heard about blockchain in regards over the last year, in particular in regards to non-fungible tokens and NFTs, but more so the potential of DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, which are a collection of smart contracts that can allow you to build new types of collective or collaborative models that can give attribution, that can be built upon shared values. They don't necessarily just have to be transactional in terms of financial. And I think that is a very exciting place for the future of where we could go. So if you take a decentralized technology, and if you take some of the things that I was talking about with a layer of participatory design and those formerly known as the audience, and you start to think about story as ways to tackle complex issues like Where There's Smoke. For instance, I'm collaborating now with the narrative medicine program at Columbia University. We're using the experience to explore ways that we can build empathetic care, and using it as a way to help health practitioners and loved ones and patients, right? And so giving story purpose, allowing the audience to become collaborators, having some decentralized way to do that, like an infrastructure that allows you to be able to make use of that. And then the potential and the promise of what it is like to have multiple interconnected worlds, and the metaverse. So this last project, I think, starts to bring together a lot of the things that I was talking about. And this is a speculation that we're doing that's kind of looking and saying, we need new myths, and it's looking and saying, what if we were to take certain things around oral traditions? And what if we were to leverage blockchain, the foundational layer of blockchain, the blockchain to be able to give attribution to different people in a way that shows the DNA and the makeup of these stories. So Blockchain Fairy Tales is an ongoing initiative. We recently premiered it at a festival, Sieges in Spain, which is a fantasy and sci-fi festival. And what was really cool is the audience came in And they started building, they went through a world building activity as a group. And that world building activity came to life as a series of fairy tales in front of them. So the story couldn't happen unless they participated. Very similar to how Where There's Smoke worked, very similar to how Frankenstein AI worked, very similar to a lot of these projects that I've mentioned today. They don't happen. The story doesn't exist without the participants being there to bring it to life, to breathe it into existence. And so what's wild about blockchain fairy tales, and this is like an example, I want you to keep in mind that this was created over the span of the duration of 2 hours. And so what it is a visualization of this world. It's all done with layers. We're working on we'll release it next month, an open source tool that allows you to work with other people to remix the web. You can do it over any site. This is being done over Miro, and we're creating multiple layers using animated GIFs and video and audio to create, in this case, an animation. And the part that this doesn't have is the voiceovers of the fairy tales that people told in those rooms based upon the worlds that they were creating. They were given a series of prompts that were kind of imagining. It's a story that goes over 7 generations, which is kind of looking at indigenous cultures and how stories were used as a way to transfer information and knowledge and ultimately wisdom, and how they were used as a technology. And it's playing with that and saying, okay, in the 7th generation, that's the future. And so the people in the room were, generation 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and they knew that the future needed their help. And so they started working together to build these artifacts that then became stories. And what you're seeing here is a representation of a visual tapestry of that story that came to life in the moment, in the room with the participants. So it doesn't have the context now because you don't hear the story that they were telling, but these visuals line up with the story that was co-created in the room. And we're using this web pervasive kind of tool that allows, it's like a stage management tool that allows people to remix the web. So all of this is kind of based on a couple principles. And in closing, I want to kind of mention these. These are guiding principles that we use at the lab and I use in my own practice to create spaces that allow for collaboration and shared, with the hopes of creating shared narratives. The first is the notion of a thematic frame, which I'll get to in a moment, this idea of the trace, granting agency, and serendipity management. So the thematic frame is that the participant can contribute to the experience because they have a pre-existing understanding of its foundation. Thematically, like Frankenstein, certain things in and around that story. So when you sit down and you start sharing things about your own life, there are elements of that thematic container in the world that you find yourself in that create a shared language around the collaboration that's happening there. The second is this notion of the trace. Participants can see their contributions within a story. And Where There's Smoke, when people did a visualization exercise, they drew something and they drew an object that they chose to save. Later in the experience, they encountered a room of all these artifacts. In the experience, the virtual side, there were Post-it notes where they would share stories about what they wish they would do before they died. There'd be places where they would collage around somebody that they had lost. There were other places where they would share something that was related to something they wish they would have said to somebody that they lost. So they could see their contributions, building on top of what the world was, being part of what that world was. Granting agency, the participant is granted agency to make decisions as a team and individually, and they can identify how their actions impacted the experience. We found that teams work well when they're 4 to 6 people. If they're too small, dominant personalities take over, and if they're too large, it becomes a consensus vortex and nobody can ever make a decision. So we try to do things in the experiences where there's moments where you're an individual, moments where you're paired, and moments where you're in a group, and you move back and forth. The last point is this idea of serendipity management. I would say that a lot of digital experiences are over-designed. They're concerned that somebody's going to break them. But the most interesting places is where you leave blank space and people can break things, because, you know, I'll do these things in my class where I'll bring a game into class that's broken, and I'll hand it to my students. I'll be really gleeful, very excited that they're going to do it. And then I'll start to do it and they'll be like, this game is horrible. And I'll say, I know, it's up to you to change it. You know, you can actually change the game. What would you do to make it better? And they start to make something, and ultimately they always make something better than I ever thought it could be. So this notion of like, how do you leave blank space in a design and allow people to bump into each other so these creative sparks can grow? Now, each of these things that I've just mentioned, I think are really important as we start to think about the metaverse. And this comment by a very large company that has, you know, all the things that have come out recently about, you know, through the Facebook papers and the whistleblower and everything that's been going on there, there's a lot of warning signs. You know, as we move into the potential of what Web 3.0 could be, the potential of the metaverse, I think we find ourselves at a time where we need to figure out how we can collectively imagine things, how we can embrace this notion of inclusive design practice and allow more voices to be part of it. The rise of Web 2.0 was really predicated by a small group of people, usually white males, that dominated that field and dictated, like, and brought about the algorithmic age that we find ourselves in today. So when I think about the metaverse, all these things that might feel like they were kind of way afar field from how people are talking about the metaverse in terms of the hardware, in terms of the interconnected worlds, in terms of the commerce, in terms of the collectibles, whatever it is, to me, it's the human element. At the lab and what I do in my own practice, it always starts with the human element. We don't get into shaping the technology until we understand what the human experience is. So here we are at a moment where we have the opportunity to potentially build Web 3.0. Are we going to leap ahead and just start building without understanding that human experience, without allowing more people to be part of that process? Are we going to kind of move into it with the goal of like, it's just all about advertising and digital commerce? You know, it's all about just making more and more money. How can these tools and these opportunities be used to tackle some of the most pressing issues that we face, the existential threats of our day? You know, how can we use these things? Storytelling is how we make sense of the world. And so I'm really hopeful that by embracing collaborative design and working with others, we can start to chart a path. And that path could be something that could be really benefited by the metaverse and the blockchain and AI. And so I want to thank you very much for letting me kind of share these crazy visions with you. Thank you. I appreciate your time. You can reach me at Lance WEILER. My email's here. And also, please visit digitalstorytellinglab.com for more information.
Thank you so much, Lance. This was a really great lecture. For people who wanna also read a recent interview that we published with Lance at the Theater Times, I'm gonna place it over here. So I welcome everyone to follow up and read more about Lance's project and his thinking about how the technology and storytelling intersect. So we're gonna start with some questions, and if anybody has any questions, please type them in the chat or in Q&A. And in the meantime, I'm going to kind of maybe ask Lance myself a question. And this was really a great trajectory, kind of overview of how the transmedia developed, and you know, coming from this sort of narrow monothematic storyline from Campbell's hero's journey towards a sort of decentralized storytelling that has a potential to engage many more people on different level. And 2 years ago, all of those things were sort of in the area of science fiction, and the pandemic speed up quite a lot of what's happened in the in this area. And everyday people seem to have a better understanding of how those things can be made and can be created, and how they can participate and how they can be part of that sort of storytelling. So it became a kind of a much more palpable for general audiences than it used to be. Yeah, I mean, what's your experience like? Because there seemed to be quite acceleration. I mean, I remember when I was doing this research 2 years ago, it was kind of on the fringes of theater industry, but now it's very much at the center front. And we're using different tools, and people seem to kind of adopt those tools with much more ease and less hesitation than they used to. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to kind of ignore those aspects of transmediality in live performance, in film, in video game, and other genres. What do you think? Like, we are in this kind of a point where there is still big discrepancy in the vocabularies that these different fields use, and also in the access to tools and in the way that people feel comfortable navigating in each other fields. What do you think might help to accelerate this interdisciplinary connections at the university levels and organizational levels?
Well, thank you for that question. I mean, I think the pandemic has greatly accelerated quite a bit. I mean, anything that was, there's a real, not only is there a much larger, base of people who are now more familiar with some of these web pervasive tools, or are more kind of accustomed to doing things remotely than maybe they were before, because it accelerated everything. I think it points to interesting, challenges, and I think you'll start to see the rise of a whole new wave of tools and resources and things that are being produced as people kind of imagine what's possible in terms of this virtual layer of connection. And then, especially as we start to move back into congregating in person, this notion of how can we take some of these things that we've learned over this time and apply them to, create these hybrid scenarios, something where there's virtual audiences and groups that are also physically in a space. The blockchain fairy tale project, for instance, and Where There's Smoke, do that, right? They have physical installations and physical audiences mixed with virtual audiences. And they, and what are the affordances and constraints of the current technologies and some of the limitations that exist there, and how do we develop and build things that allow us to be more seamless or to move at the speed of creativity? I think some of the challenges really, and what I'm excited about, is I feel like it rests within inclusive design practice. I feel it rests within, sometimes these concepts are very difficult potentially to understand. And I think that there's a real kind of dominant narrative that you're going to see over and over again. Same thing happened with transmedia, where certain terms become something that various industries really latch onto, a lot of times primarily branding and marketing, and they'll try to own that. Meta by Facebook is a big move in that direction to create confusion around what the potential of the metaverse could be, that people just start to think that Facebook is the metaverse, right? And they get confused by what the potential is. So I think, to answer your question, finding and creating experiences that allow somebody to be immersed with a group of people from very different disciplines allow you to be able to explore beyond, to challenge assumptions, right? So if we just sit back and allow a certain number of large entities to just do the overreach into what this next web is, we're at a huge deficit. I think the answer lies in our ability to co-design things, to tell stories to each other and to use those stories and make them performative in certain ways to help us make sense of the world, right? All these things were laid in the parts that I showed you throughout the course of it, right? The narrative went totally awry during the election, and we had misinformation and deception, narratives that just became so toxic that they have literally slowed, you know, the progress and the fight of a global pandemic. Not to mention they've muddied the waters and put on, you know, state with local municipalities, you know, so the erosion of truth is an example, right? Like, so if we don't step in and become part of this process, we are going to be left behind. And I think that that's probably fundamentally the benefit is that you hope maybe out of a shared experience that is historically almost unprecedented in our lifetimes, that we would have this moment of reflective pause, and that we would be able to kind of look and say, what do we really value? And you see that with, like, you know, I've seen titles around the Great Resignation, you know, where people are like, these jobs don't align with the values that we have, that I you know, I don't have a work-life balance, and I can work remotely, or I can work for somewhere else, or I can work for myself, right? And so you have like this awakening kind of thing that was really interesting. But I don't know, muscle memory is very strong, and certain narrative, the more it's pushed forward. So when I heard that they were going to call, I thought they were going to call themselves Metaverse. So, you know, like when I heard that they were doing that, one is like, okay, this is a distraction tactic to pull away from all the negative press that they have. Let's quick create a new name and put it out. I'm sure that they put a lot of thought into what they're going to name themselves, but they've been staking that claim for a while, you know, when they started talking about that they were a metaverse company. So, but they're just one of many that are going to try to make inroads in that space. So how can we carry forward things that we learned during the pandemic, the values that we think are important, and how do we bring those values into the technology and the stories and the worlds that we build together? So I don't have an exact answer to that, but I think that there are certain things that were shown, you know, with futures, there's always this idea of signals, like there are these breadcrumbs to the future. Like I remember seeing one during the pandemic that said ATMs, like in Vietnam, they had food ATMs. Immediately, it makes you start to think, well, in the future, will food be a currency? Will it be changed in terms of how it's distributed? And it starts to make you think. So there are a lot of signals out there all around us. It's just a matter of like, how do we tune into them? And I think that there were some really powerful ones that were happening in and around and are continuing to happen because of the condition that we found ourselves in within the global, you know, this global pandemic.
All right, thank you so much, Lance. We have another question. Somebody's asking about the potential environmental and social costs of AI and the blockchain technology and you know, data centers and all of those things. The energy and use of AI and data centers, and so is inescapable. You know, those things eat up quite a lot of energy. And so how do we, this is a question from BQ, how do you see the role of the metaverse in this context? And BQ says, having recently read Kate Crawford's Atlas of AI, I'm increasingly concerned about the environmental and social costs of AI and blockchain technology. Particularly the level of energies that those things eat up, and what do you think? What would be the role of the metaverse in this context, in the environmental context? Like how can we progress developing this technology and relying on the technology, knowing how environmentally costly it is? Can we possibly find some ways to mitigate those costs? What's your take on it? We have a very interesting question, Vicky. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that that's an incredibly pressing question. Like, I think with the advancement with technology, we have real carbon issues. We have real, you know, a variety of really very, very challenging complex problems, right? I mean, I have my brother-in-law is a systems engineer and is building out the next gen of the internet through a variety of universities. We've had some really interesting conversations about this, you know, the environmental impact of, you know, for instance, the blockchain and the reliance, or how we're, you know, leaning towards what's possible with AI. And it was interesting because I think that there's certain efficiencies that come with technology, and then there are certain things that are incredibly challenging, right? Like in terms of we have like a disposable culture. Like, I mean, everything is about like the next generation of devices. You know, it's like we're not designing things to last longer. You know, we're kind of designing for, you know, a consumption and a throwaway culture. So I think fundamentally, like, if the devices that we're interfacing with are doing that, and then if the devices are then powered in certain ways through, you know, artificial intelligence, and in some respects, some of the, you know, what'll come later with the metaverse, as I was mentioning, the potential of the blockchain to be a layer on it, AI to be a layer, all the hosting requirements, the hardware requirements. It's like a tremendous amount of, you know, raw materials that are being used, energy that's being consumed, and methods that are just like all about disposable culture. So I think that there's so many layers there that are really very complex, right? You know, in terms of what we do. And I think that I don't have an easy answer, obviously, for this question or this series of questions that are packed in here. I think the only thing that we can do is, or one of the things that we can do is just try to really believe and lean into science. But also, I do think it keeps coming back, and you'll hear me say this over and over again. I think it comes back to, you know, transdisciplinary groups of people working together to be able to problem solve some of these challenges, and using speculation and futures thinking to help us kind of model out and try to find solutions that maybe break from the ones that are so kind of entrenched or reliant upon certain entities or groups that have financial interests within them. So I don't know. I mean, one of the things that we're trying to do with the Blockchain Fairy Tale Project is create a speculation where it's world building. And so each part of it will be kind of about, you know, imagining future societies and then determining the values that shared values that are part of those future societies. To me, a lot of what your question is a huge, you know, foundational element of that, right? Like, if we don't get some of these things in check with how we're going to deal with the planet, then, you know, I mean, it's really disturbing. It's like we're constantly living in a really bad sci-fi novel, you know, like billionaires are colonizing space. And what does that mean to the rest of the people who are left on the planet? You know, so I think that once again, to kind of come back to, you know, at least in our role of what we're trying to do at the Digital Storytelling Lab at Columbia University is create speculations that allow us to potentially look through different lenses and perspectives that have as many diverse groups of people and those perspectives around the table as possible. But it's a really complex set of problems. It's like a wicked challenge, a wicked series of challenges that are interconnected. But, you know, there's so much there, from the education side, the economy side, to, you know, just, you know, it's a lot. It makes your head explode. You know, like your question is making my head explode. You know, like how, but I think one thing that I came to realize in my own work that I didn't know was, and I never realized this, but I came to realize later in life that I'm actually a systems thinker. I didn't even know that was possible. I never went to a university. I have dyslexia, so I had a learning disability, and I learned in a different way. And so I wasn't able to go to school. I ended up becoming a journeyman and working commercial production and traveling the world and doing that type of work. But in doing so, I started to realize, I started to think about systems and juxtaposing things against other things that maybe, I don't know, I just saw connections. Like I could see connections maybe sometimes that weren't as recognizable maybe to others. And so I wonder if some of these challenges are really kind of about that, like finding that the connection points through very diverse perspectives that challenge and get us beyond the no, we tried that, that won't work, no, but, and kind of, to my point earlier, lean us into a yes and space. So yeah, so that's some of my thoughts about that. We could have a whole much longer conversation about the topic.
Okay. I want to have another question. I was wondering, because you talk about a lot also about sort of how those decentralized storytelling patterns and structures and models, we sort of assume, working in this business, in theater and film, we sort of assume that stories are good and they do good. But we have also seen, as in your work on this quite a lot too, how stories can actually not do good. Like we sort of assume that stories are fundamentally morally good. The telling stories is morally good, yeah. But what stories are being told right now in the public sphere through those decentralized systems are not always, good stories that we want to propagate. And nonetheless, we're struggling with it right now, like how much Facebook should control the discourse, with the anti-scientific, anti-social impulses, and how much of the discourses should be controlled. What do we do with those stories, with those sort of, conspiracy theories and other ways that people put together facts, or even facts and fiction, yeah, and how they sort of navigate this world, and how people structure their own realities based on what they receive and how they receive it. And so there is this kind of a quite, challenging ways to think about the censorship and free speech and storytelling as a moral question and as a kind of a survival question, even for the human species, because it will depend, our survival will depend on which stories take over and which stories continue to subvert what we need to do. So I'm wondering, do you guys at the digital lab, are you guys struggling with that, sort of on philosophical level, on moral level, in terms of, because we focus, there's kind of the impulse is that like stories are good. Yeah, we kind of always, as a culture, celebrate storytelling as something good. But then we see the flip side of it, and then it's like, how much destruction stories can do. And how do you, the fiction element of the story can be tricky. Yeah? Like which fictional stories are true, which fictional stories, people kind of lose a sense of reality and have a very difficult time, I see, to separate what's real, what's not real, in that kind of metaverse universe that we sort of already kind of somewhat exist in the social media sphere. And so, what do you think? How do we, tackle that without, being kind of totalitarian and controlling the discourse in that way?
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, I think these questions are very philosophically deep. The last one was philosophically deep and very very challenging. This one is too, because what you're really kind of getting at is if we make sense of the world through the stories that we tell and certain narratives push through, the biggest challenge that we face, and we saw this over the last election cycle, is the erosion of trust and truth, right? And so one part of it feels like it's something in terms of helping folks to understand or to be able to fact check things, or to be able to almost in a digital literacy kind of standpoint be able to identify things. But the other challenge that we have is with synthetic media. We have this rise of the ability to very easily manipulate things. Project Immerse was us kind of exploring this space, right? It was like looking and saying, apophenia, like what it's kind of like if you're thinking about buying a car and you're thinking about a certain type of car, and then all of a sudden you start talking about it, all of a sudden you start seeing the car all over the place, right? Like the car was always there, you just started to see it, right? So this notion of these patterns are really dangerous in the sense that they can take, you look at QAnon is, and there's been a lot of writing about this, that it's constructed, or it almost has the construction of an augmented reality game. It's just something that really defies logic. And when you look at it at a distance, you can't even imagine how anybody could succumb to it. But then when you immerse yourself in certain worlds, and like when we do Project Immerse, for instance, the idea is to allow you to step into a world in a safe way that allows you to experience something. So then maybe you start to say like, oh, that's how a conspiracy theory is shaped. What were the ingredients of that? Why did I go along with that? How did that operate, right? So in some of the work that we're doing at the lab, we're really just kind of scratching at the surface and just trying to see, can we, through collaborative spaces and these immersive experiences, can we allow people in a safe way with others to try things out, to step into these worlds? And maybe by stepping into those worlds, it helps them when they encounter them outside of them, right? So I think for a lot of the work that we're doing, we're looking, and story is incredibly powerful, and like anything else, it can be used for good or evil, right? And so I think, and it's something that controls, and so I think like just finding ways that we can understand how to navigate, where these stories come from, who's accountable around them, how we can't just solely rely on technology solutions to solve the problem, how we need to, it's an educational issue, it's a technological issue, it's similar to what we're talking about with climate. It's when I was going back and talking about systems thinking, it's like a whole, it's literally so interconnected that it's hard to extract any one part without it, being tied to so many other things and the cause and effect from it. But I guess the way that we look at it at the lab is, can we build immersive spaces that allow people to step into them, that challenges their perception in some way, and maybe in doing so allows them to discover something that they didn't know before, or allows them to learn with others and from others in ways that maybe they weren't able to do previously.
All right. Thank you so much, Lance. This was great lecture, and we much appreciate you visiting MetaLab. This lecture was part of the Transmedia Art Seminar Series of co-sponsored by Mahindra Humanities Center and MetaLab at Harvard. We invite you to check out all our other future lectures, and we will be posting this lecture online at Mahindra Humanities Center website soon. So please check it out and share among your friends as well, and invite them as well. I'm going to stop the recording now.